Okay, Music 12. We're going to jump straight into chapter 5, which is on songs. This is a great chapter. It really is a familiar topic for most people. We listen to songs on sometimes an everyday basis, but we are going to think about this about storytelling potential through music and words. In the previous week, we talked about drama and dance and music and how they can be used to tell stories. This time, we're backing off just a little bit and paring things down to the lyrics and the music that helps tell the story as well. I would encourage you to open up the chapter 5 or the week 5 writing assignment so that you can follow along with the questions and take some good notes as we hit on some of those subjects. That way, you make your assignment a little bit more streamlined for yourself. So let's go ahead and begin. We see here uh, some of the artists that we're going to be discussing in this chapter. We're going to be looking at music from a variety of genres, um, cultures, and also different eras of music history as well. So let's jump right in. Songs and storytelling. Song is perhaps the most familiar and universal form of musical storytelling. Unlike opera, it does not require a large space, costumes, or staging. It can be collaborative, but it is often performed by a single person. It is also compelling, for we generally get a great deal of pleasure out of using our imaginations to visualize the characters and events of a story. And many times and places, in fact, song and storytelling have been considered inseparable. The storyteller cannot imagine communicating through any means other than music. The purpose of song, of course, is not always to tell stories. Many songs present philosophical ideas, or describe scenes, or support worship, or encourage dancing. In this chapter, however, we will focus on songs and collections of songs that outline clear narratives, and we will examine ways in which the music helps to communicate the story. As we will see, it can do so in many ways. Song cycles. We will begin by looking at collections of songs that work together to tell a story that is emotionally complex, if not heavy in plot detail. Such a collection can be called a song cycle. A song cycle usually consists of about 8 to 20 songs that use carefully crafted texts and music to present a cohesive narrative. Each song is distinct from the others, and the order cannot be changed. While the term song cycle is most often applied to works of art from the art music world, it is valid across many genres. When a popular artist releases an album of songs that accomplish the purpose of a song cycle, however, the product is referred to as a concept album. So later on in the chapter, we'll be taking a look at a song cycle from composer Franz Schubert. We'll also be looking at a concept album from a more recent artist, Beyonce. Both do similar things, even though they were from different time periods. They have a collection of songs that work together to tell a bigger story. The most important difference between a song cycle and a concept album is that the former is most commonly conceived of with live performance in mind, whereas the latter, the concept album, is often developed in the studio and consumed as a recording. For this reason, a song cycle is more likely to have limited instrumentation, while producers of concept albums often have a wider variety of sound tools at their disposal. We will begin by considering a concept album that includes not only sounds, but images and spoken poetry. And that concept album is Beyonce. I'm going to go back for 1 second to notice the differences here. That when we talk about the song cycle, we're going to be looking at Franz Schubert specifically today. We're going to be dealing with chamber music, the idea that we're working with performances that were performed in people's homes, which meant that you could only have a small number of instruments within that space. Whereas we know from the concept albums that we hear from modern day artists, they're using um, library samples from their computer software. So the amount of sounds, just digitally alone, plus the instruments that they can bring into the studio to record on different dates with different musicians, is just far more expansive. So even though these are accomplishing the same thing, sometimes the tools that we have in the modern day are just greater. Doesn't mean that it tells the music, gives the music any more power, though. We'll see. On April 23rd, 2016, popular music star Beyonce released her sixth album, Lemonade. The release was accompanied by a 65-minute film of the same name that premiered on the popular television network HBO. This album, which was influenced by a range of genres spanning from hip-hop to country, became critically acclaimed for its musical variety, while the accompanying film was admired for its astounding visual cinematography. The work as a whole has also been lauded for its unapologetic celebration of womanhood and black culture. And here we can, of course, see Beyonce. This is an older picture from 2013. Superstar, of course. Let's continue. At its center, Lemonade is a concept album revolving around infidelity, seemingly sparked by the infamous accounts of Beyonce and husband Jay-Z's marital struggles. The songs, which mirror Beyonce's personal experiences with infidelity, touch on themes such as heartbreak, revenge, and forgiveness. The accompanying film follows the singer's journey from betrayal to healing by dividing the 12 songs into separate chapters: intuition, denial, anger, apathy, emptiness, accountability, reformation, forgiveness, resurrection, hope, and redemption. Though the album's focus is on Beyonce's personal healing, there's also an underlying political theme, for the album recognizes the struggle of Black Americans by addressing issues such as Black womanhood and police brutality. Here, we will discuss several songs and consider their visual counterparts, exploring different stages of the story's development. So again, this is all within the one album, Lemonade. All of these themes come up, and all of the 12 songs are divided into these different chapters. So it all kind of has a connection within itself. One of the most noteworthy aspects of Lemonade is the poetry that Beyonce recites between each song. These poems help to tie the story together and clarify dramatic details. Beyonce's recitations include excerpts from the poems of Warsan Shire, a Somali British poet known for writing about not only personal experiences, but also the struggles of women, refugees, immigrants, and other marginalized groups of people. Throughout the recitation, listeners are confronted both with abstract images and with descriptions of the emotions that prevail in each chapter. Consider, for example, the poetry that precedes the song Hold Up, which Beyonce recites in eerie, whispering tones. Immediately following the passage, the song Hold Up begins, so after the poetry. This upbeat single reflects the denial chapter of Beyonce's journey. The song at first seems optimistic. Its playful, reggae-inspired beat and major key make the song sound like a laid-back summertime hit. The lyrics of the chorus seem to convey a positive attitude, repeating the phrase, "Hold up, they don't love you like I love you. Slow down, they don't love you like I love you." However, the verses express more negative emotions. By considering the lyrics in their entirety and noticing the duality between the verses and the chorus, the listener gets the impression that Beyonce is fighting with her emotions, bouncing back and forth between denial and anger. The visual aspect of the song also reveals a dichotomous nature. Beyonce herself seems to be a visual representation of lightheartedness, dressed in a long, flowing gown of bright yellow. However, her look is meant to be a representation of Oshun, a West African goddess of fresh waters, love, and fertility. This characterization is further emphasized in the beginning of the scene, where Beyonce emerges from a building surrounded by cascading water. Although Oshun is viewed as a benevolent deity, folk tales often discuss Oshun's harsh temper when she has been wronged. Beyonce embodies this character throughout the song, smiling playfully as she bashes windows, fire hydrants, and cars with a baseball bat. So we're going to see, or I encourage you to watch the video on the next slide or so, where we hear this very playful, very summertime sounding reggae beat with a major mode, a major key signature that we hear in the music, yet the music in the video don't seem to match, right? There is kind of a dichotomy happening. We're hearing one thing, but we see something different, and the lyrics even are telling us maybe that something isn't quite right here. So, like I said, I would encourage you to watch this video, maybe open it in a new tab so that you can read the previous slide as well. Go back and make sure that you're picking up on all the small details about the beat that we're hearing behind this track. Okay, let's go on to the next track here. In the following song, Don't Hurt Yourself, which is performed during the chapter titled Anger, Beyonce leaves behind her playful nature for full-on vengeance. The song, which features rock musician Jack White, known mostly for his association with the White Stripes, has definite rock and roll characteristics, including heavy rhythms and distorted vocals. Beyonce expresses her anger in the song's opening lyric. I'm going to paraphrase this. Who the F do you think I is? You ain't married to no average B boy. The mood throughout the song remains the same, angry and vengeful. Beyonce concludes with a final warning. If you try this again, you're going to lose your wife. With these lyrics, it becomes apparent that Beyonce's anger is directed toward her cheating husband. However, the song also includes one of the first instances in which Beyonce addresses the album's other theme, the struggles of being a black American, particularly a black American woman. In the middle of the first verse, Beyonce interpolates an excerpt from Malcolm X's famous speech, Who Taught You to Hate Yourself? In which he says, the most disrespected person in America is the black woman. The most unprotected woman in America is the black woman. The most neglected person in America is the black woman. That comes from Malcolm X. Beyonce's anger seems to be not only directed at her husband, but also at the mistreatment of black women in America. This continues to be an underlying theme throughout the remainder of the album. For instance, in the following song, Sorry, one of the most popular singles from the album, the last lyric reads, You better call Becky with the good hair. The term Becky is a popular colloquialism for a white woman, and this lyric seems to imply that the other woman was white, who was cheating with her husband. This reflects the negative stereotype that black women are less desirable than other women, and it implies that Beyonce was cheated on because of her blackness. So again, pause my video, and instead check out this video of the song Don't Hurt Yourself by Beyonce featuring Jack White. The next few songs on the album, which belong to the chapters Apathy and Emptiness, exhibit various emotions, but it is with the song Sandcastles that Beyonce arrives at the most difficult and important point in her journey, forgiveness. The music itself presents raw emotions with its simple, bare piano accompaniment and expressive vocals. Beyonce's singing style is very different in this song. Her voice at times sounds shaky or raspy, reflecting the heart that is inevitable when confronting a cheating partner. She sings of her damaged marriage, of the fight and broken hearts, yet she reveals her reluctance to walk away from it all by singing, Oh, and I know I promised that I couldn't stay, baby. Every promise don't work out that way. Like the music itself, the visual portion of the song is very personal, including loving scenes of Beyonce and husband Jay-Z laughing together and embracing. The following short song, Forward, features English singer James Blake, who sings a heartbreaking melody. With the infidelity narrative reaching its conclusion in the previous song, this interlude pulls away from the story of Beyonce's struggles and introduces a new focus on the previously mentioned underlying theme, the struggles of black Americans. The visual counterpart of the song features several important figures in the fight for equality and justice, including the mothers of Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner, and Michael Brown, Sabrina Fulton, Gwen Carr, and Leslie McSpadden, respectively. Each woman is shown holding a photograph of her son who was killed by unnecessary violence and brutality. So we see that we're connecting beyond just Beyonce's personal experience. She's connecting this to the larger issue of police brutality toward African Americans. This is the video right here. I encourage you to watch this. Again, musically, because this is a more heartfelt song, and as we just learned, has a very serious and meaningful backstory to it, and you can see it in the video too. The music is also, I think, more bare. It's a little bit more honest and reflective in a way. When we hear the piano and vocals alone, it really does give us a different impression than a track that has drums and keyboards and bass and a lot of activity. This is a little bit more bare and sounds more honest and earnest, I think, in my opinion. Okay, continuing on, the final chapters of Beyonce's journey, Hope and Redemption, feature upbeat and inspirational songs such as Freedom and the hit single Formation. The powerful lyrics and gospel style of Freedom convey an inspirational message about continuing on in the midst of adversity. This message is not only a reflection of Beyonce's power to move beyond her personal struggles while dealing with her husband's infidelity, it is also an anthem intended to uplift Black Americans in their struggles against inequality. At the song's conclusion, there is an excerpt from a speech given by Hattie White, Jay-Z's grandmother, that elucidates the meaning of the album's title. I had my ups and downs, but I always find the inner strength to pull myself up. I was served lemons, but I made lemonade. That's pretty powerful. And again, these are the two music videos that accompany these songs. Freedom on the left featuring Kendrick Lamar, and also Formation here on the right. I would encourage you to watch both of those and maybe turn on the subtitles when you watch these videos in case you want to really pick up on the lyrics of the song. It can be helpful to know what are they actually singing about? What story are they trying to tell? I'm going to jump ahead here while I hope you watch those. Okay, so we've gone through Beyonce. We talked about the concept album, which of course is a more 20th century invention. But we're going to go back now to the late 1700s into the 1800s, what we call the Romantic period, Romantic era of music, and looking at the song cycle. And one of the best examples, in some ways maybe the king of the song cycle, was Franz Schubert. Here we see a painting of him. So Franz Schubert lived a quiet life in Vienna, where he wrote over 600 songs for performance at intimate domestic gatherings. Although he died young and without achieving significant fame outside of Vienna, his work became widely known in the mid-19th century, and today he is considered to be one of the finest composers of the era. Before we can look at Schubert's songs, we need to know something about the cultural context in which he was working. So this is going to get into song and national character. In the early 19th century, new ideas about national identity were in the air. Many of these ideas were rooted in the work of German philosopher Johann Gottfried von Herder, who argued that spoken language influenced an individual's character. He suggested, for example, that Germans all thought in roughly the same way because they spoke the same language, which in turn guided and structured their intellectual activity. From here, the notion that peoples who spoke the same language should participate in bounded, self-governing communities, nations, in fact, was not far removed. So what they're saying here is that people who speak the same language should create their own countries, essentially. Remember that we're coming from a period in Europe where we had these huge empires, the Ottoman Empire, the Roman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where we had large areas of Europe that were all ruled by these empires or larger nation states. So this is the first time that these smaller subsections of these empires are thinking about becoming their own nations. And this was an argument for that from von Herder. During Schubert's time, neither Germany nor Austria existed in anything resembling their present forms. But the idea that communities of people who spoke a common language should constitute autonomous nations was quickly taking a hold. Herder also believed that the most authentic form of national character was to be found among those least corrupted by cosmopolitan influences, the peasants who worked the land. Before the late 18th century, impoverished rural folk were treated with contempt. It was not believed that they had anything to offer the ruling classes other than labor. Following Herder, however, they became the one true source of authentic folk culture, and therefore key to a nation's ability to understand itself. And here we can see a portrait of von Herder. Collectors began to scour the countryside for folk stories, folk poetry, folk dances, and folk songs. These were compiled and published for popular consumption. Perhaps the most famous of such collectors were the Brothers Grimm, who were actually Jacob Ludwig Karl and Wilhelm Karl, who were responsible for first recording many of the fairy tales, including Cinderella, Hansel and Gretel, Snow White, Rapunzel, and Sleeping Beauty, that have been ceaselessly told and retold around the world ever since. So again, this is the idea of collectors, in this case the Brothers Grimm, who were looking through the countryside, through ordinary folks' lives, and trying to find these stories or these folk tales. All of this is important to our discussion of Schubert for two reasons. First, the elevation of the German language meant that German songs had the potential to become art. So we're making a distinction here between the songs that people might just sing as folk songs in their home or at a party or for a wedding in the countryside versus something that could be performed at a concert or at a social gathering. We'll talk about the salon culture later today in this lesson. I'm going to continue here. Before Schubert's time, songs were regarded as trivial popular entertainment. Schubert's songs, however, were taken seriously as cultural expression of the highest order. Second, general fascination with folk culture and art influenced Schubert's approach to writing songs. He often chose texts that imitated folk poetry, or at least dwelt on rural subject matter, and he frequently set these to music in a folk-like style. Although some of his music seems very simple, Schubert did not resort to the folk idiom because he lacked ability or imagination. Instead, he imitated genuine folk songs to augment his storytelling. We will see all of this influence at work in Schubert's 1824 song cycle, The Lovely Maid of the Mill. Before turning to the story in music, however, we need to consider the setting in which the song was meant to be experienced. So we will take a look at this song cycle from Schubert in just a moment. But let's talk about where it would have been performed first. In the Vienna of Schubert's time, music lovers supported an economy of small, in-home concerts known as salons. A salon might be hosted by a wealthy family for the purpose of advertising their cultural and social capital. The performance would take place in the family's living room, where visitors could admire their furnishings and art. Hosting a salon was also considerably cheaper than maintaining a private orchestra, so it became the preferred means of cultural expression as Vienna's wealth slowly shifted from a small group of aristocrats to a larger middle class. Naturally, certain types of music were preferable for salon entertainment. Only a few performers could fit in the venue at a time, and loud instruments were not welcome. A great demand arose, therefore, for solo piano music, chamber music, which has 2 to 5 individuals each playing their own parts, like a string quartet, for example, and song, all of which Schubert produced in enormous quantities. So we see this great demand. People of the middle class now have a little bit of money, not enough to afford a huge orchestra to have all the time, but they could pay for a handful of musicians or a solo pianist or a piano player plus a singer to sing some songs in their house and to entertain their guests at these salons. All of Schubert's songs and chamber music were conceived of with this sort of environment in mind. In fact, he became so prominent in the salon scene that a special term, Schubertiade, was developed to describe a salon performance that featured only his music, the music of Schubert. So they call it this Schubertiade. Salons were comparatively informal, and listeners would gather around the performers in close proximity. Paintings of salon performances show listeners in rapt attention. This type of engagement was with music was typical more generally of Schubert's era, when the public held art in high regard and believed that artists were in a position to communicate profound truths. Schubert's listeners sought not only entertainment but also enlightenment, transformation, and catharsis. The lovely maid of the mill offered all three. So we see here one characteristic aspect of the Romantic period that we should know is that rather than the composer being having to work for a duke or a king or someone who held a court, someone of the aristocracy, excuse me, we see now that the composers are more seen a little bit like a modern day rock star, where we view them as having some kind of redeeming quality or some kind of interest to us. They say here that they communicate profound truths that we're kind of changing the way that we view the composer, and we'll learn about that more in a later chapter as well. This is a painting that features Schubert here at the piano, and this is what a salon would have looked like. You see, everyone is gathered around the piano. Everyone is really nice and close. These people, especially, are right behind the piano player here, Schubert. So it kind of goes to see what would this kind of event have been like. And when we hear the music that is performed, it's not going to be a full orchestra experience. It's going to be a smaller group. We call it chamber music because you're performing in someone's chamber. But at the same time, because you're in a smaller venue, the music can be very dramatic with just the piano, for example, and a singer. In this small venue, that would actually have been plenty loud to get a full sonic experience. So just keep that in mind as we watch a couple of the videos coming up. So we're going to take a look at the song cycle from Franz Schubert called The Lovely Maid of the Mill. Let's get into its source and inspiration first. The poetry for this song cycle was written by Wilhelm Müller, a prolific author of song texts. Müller was one of many German poets who looked to folk models for inspiration, and the folk-like characteristics of his verse influenced Schubert's music. Müller's collection of 25 poems was first published in 1820, and Schubert began setting it to music just a few years later, while he was recovering from a severe bout of illness. Schubert's spirits were low at the time he embarked on this project, for he feared that he would never fully regain his health. Indeed, he never did. Schubert succumbed to his illness 5 years later, just as he was on the brink of achieving success outside of Vienna. So he died pretty young, actually. Let's get into the story of The Lovely Maid of the Mill. So remember, this is a poem that would have been written by this author here, Wilhelm Müller. And he specifically thought that these were poetry texts that should be set to music. In the poems, Müller tells the story of a young journeyman miller who has completed his initial apprentice and set out to find employment. So it's a young man looking for a job. He walks through the woods until he finds a stream, and then follows the stream to a mill, where he does indeed find a job waiting. So remember, a mill is where they would use the power of the river essentially to crush things like grain or wheat so that we can make things like flour. He walks through the woods until, jumping ahead here. He also finds the miller's daughter, and falls in love with her immediately. At first, she seems to reciprocate, and he is overjoyed to have won her affection. Slowly, however, the miller begins to suspect that the girl in fact loves the hunter who has been hanging out about the mill. As his suspicion turns to certainty, the miller experiences anger, grief, and finally, resignation. Having lost his true love forever, he drowns himself in the brook. So one thing that we should note here is that, just to be sensitive and aware, is that one of the popular trends here in the art cycles of Schubert is a fixation on the sadness, and sometimes this leads to some of the characters going through suicidal thoughts or actually committing suicide. It's a little bit romanticized in kind of a awful way as that sounds, but it's to show that extreme sadness of the characters, which was kind of in fashion at the time. If you think about, emo music, for example, or these genres of music that kind of focus on our most negative emotions, but using them to kind of find that catharsis, like we saw in the previous slide, it really does give it a different meaning. So, of course, if just to be sympathetic, please, if you are having any thoughts like that, try to find some help. And I just want to make a note of that here as we get into this cycle here. It is worth noting that Schubert and Beyonce's song cycles have a great deal in common. Both address the suffering that can come with love, and both express the intense emotions of the wrong party. It seems that we have never told enough stories about the difficulty of navigating a romantic relationship. The nuances of each musical story, however, are unique to the time and place in which each was crafted. Beyonce tells a tale of empowerment and reconciliation, while Schubert's protagonist seems to give up in the face of a romantic stymie. The story told in The Lovely Maid of the Mill, however, exhibits a variety of 19th century values. The period extending roughly from 1815 to 1900 is referred to in the arts as the Romantic era. In the realms of both literature and music, consumers expected insight into the inner emotional lives of individuals, whether they were fictional protagonists or the creators themselves. So this is to say, in the Romantic era, the audiences are very interested in getting into the minds of somebody else. What are the emotions that people experience, right? These were things that maybe often weren't talked about, or things that weren't found in art, music, or in art of any kind. Let's continue here. Two of the topics addressed in The Lovely Maid of the Mill, love and suicide, were especially prevalent in the Romantic era, while the tale's rural setting exemplifies the romantic interest in nature. While the story is not particularly interesting in its own terms, the music allows us to experience every nuance of the protagonist's widely varying emotional states. We will examine 4 songs, the first, the last, and 2 from intermediate points in the miller's emotional journey. In each case, we will look at how Schubert's musical decisions amplify and communicate the emotional and dramatic contents of the poetry. The textual contents, frequent word repetition, and generous use of exclamation points all paint a picture of an enthusiastic, if naive, young man. His outlook is positive and he sees nothing but joy in his future. He also indicates a clear preference for individual liberty. He is not, in other words, the type of young man who is eager to take on the responsibilities of marriage. Schubert translates all of this enthusiasm and simplistic good nature into his music. He seems to imagine the miller's words as constituting a folk-type song, which the man literally sings as he walks through the woods. To do so, Schubert keeps his setting, the music crafted to suit a set of words very simple. To begin with, he creates a strophic song, in which each stanza of the text is set to the same music. We've seen that word before, strophic song. As a result, We hear the same melody and accompaniment 5 times in a row. This is a standard form for European and American folk music, which is traditionally learned by ear and memorized. One can easily master the melody, which can then be used to sing a limitless amount of text. This form is also common in the Christian hymn tradition. In all of these cases, the focus is meant to be on the meaning of the words. That's to say, some advantages of the strophic song is because the melody stays the same, it is easy to remember, so you can have more variety of words to help tell a story without having to learn 5 different melodies. You learn one melody and then just 5 sets of words. It really does help with the memory of this kind of music in the folk tradition, which Schubert is copying. So we're looking at Wandering, which is one of the songs from The Lovely Maid of the Mill. It's the very first one. Schubert's strophic melody is simple and catchy. The opening melodic phrase is heard twice, as is the last, while the middle section presents an additional melody in sequence. That is to say, it is repeated at a different pitch level, lower in this case. In total, therefore, the song contains 3 short melodic ideas, all of which are repeated either verbatim or with minor alterations. Schubert's melody, however, does not quite imitate a folk song. It is in fact fairly challenging to sing, as it contains a number of difficult leaps in the first and third sections. His piano accompaniment also walks the line between simple and sophisticated. It utilizes a straightforward pattern of arpeggiated harmonies, a technique by which the notes in the triad are played from lowest to highest, or vice versa, none of which can challenge the ear, but it is denser and more varied than one would expect in the folk tradition. So that's to say, yes, this has some folk qualities, but when you look at the way that he writes for the piano, he is writing some things, um, you know, that are more dense or maybe slightly more sophisticated than we might hear in a folk song, for example. Over the course of the song cycle, however, the listener comes to realize that the piano does more than just support the singer. Schubert encourages us to hear the piano as a second storyteller. Perhaps its arpeggiated accompaniments, again, that's the broken chords of the song, which are present in almost every song, represents the gurgling of the brook. So already we see a connection that the piano is almost acting like the river that was so central to this story. When the arpeggiations are absent, it is always for a significant reason. The brook, or the river itself, turns out to be a very important character. In addition to being present in many of the texts, it actually becomes the narrator for the final poem. We don't know any of this when we first hear the opening song, but in retrospect, we must think twice about the piano, what the piano has to contribute. So, this is the first song, Wandering, from The Lovely Maid of the Mill by Schubert. When we look at this, again, let's look 1, 2, 3. We see all 5 verses of the lyric. This is the English translation, but this recording, of course, is in German. Let's go ahead and take a listen to this one. We hear the arpeggiated piano.
Das muss ein schlechter Müller sein, die niemals will das Wandern ein. Das Wandern, das Wandern, das Wandern, das Wandern.
Now we hear the second verse. It has the same melody that this verse had.
Das hat nicht Rast bei Tag und Nacht, ich stets auf Wanderschaft bedacht. Das Wasser, das Wasser, das Wasser, das Wasser.
I'll pause it right there. I would encourage you to watch and listen to the whole thing, but you do see here that there's also an internal repetition happening Within each of the verses, we see this is wandering, wandering, and ends with wandering. The second line, stream, stream, and stream. Here, wheels, wheels, and wheels. Talking about the mill wheels, mill wheels, mill wheels. And here, millstones, millstones, millstones. And then back to wandering, wandering, wandering. So again, these internal repetitions are important to recognize, and it's what makes each of these have some consistency and tells this story in a way, right? It's about the repetition. It's the young man wandering and discovering this place where he thinks that he can create, get a job, create a life for himself, perhaps, okay? You can also see that in just listening to that piano part, that it really does sound like he's following a river. We don't know that, again, if it was our first time listening, but from having read the previous slide, we know that the piano is going to act as an allegory for the brook or for the river throughout all of the song cycle. Let's move on to the next one here. It's called Mine, from The Lovely Maid of the Mill. Schubert brings his text to life with equally joyful music. He sets a brisk tempo, and the singer rushes through the words with a sense of youthful excitement. This is most certainly not a folk song. To begin with, it is not strophic, but through composed, a term used to indicate a song that pairs a unique melody with each line of a poetic text instead of repeating the same melody. So this next song from the set is called Mine. It has a different format to it. Instead of being the same melody for each of the 5 verses, it has what's called a through composed structure. So each new idea is almost as if the composer was writing it and coming up with a new idea as he was going along. There's no real order to it. This song is also too complex to be perceived as a folk product. Schubert uses a ternary form, which is A, B, A, in which the first 10 lines of poetry and their accompanying music constitute the A section and are therefore heard at the beginning and end of the song. The A section begins with another sequence. This time, a melodic fragment is heard at a higher and higher pitch levels, an indication of the speaker's excitement. The A section ends with a rapid passage of notes that rocket to the highest pitch on the word mine. The B section, apart from having a unique character, is in a different key than the A section. In this case, it's B flat major instead of D major, as in the A section. This gives the song an added sense of wonder and delight. The piano accompaniment provides gurgling arpeggiated harmonies throughout. So again, the piano is still acting as the brook in this case. Let's go ahead and listen to this one. Again, because this is a set of songs, the whole thing is actually pretty short, only 2 minutes or so here. Again, these are the English translations, but we're going to be listening to this in the original language, which was German. Piano introduction here.
Bächlein, lasst dein Rauschen sein, Räder, stellt euer Brausen ein, ihr munteren Waldvögelein, groß und klein.
Again, we heard the same idea at different pitch levels, going higher and higher.
Durch den Hain, aus und eine Schale, heut ein Dreimal ein. Durch den Hain, aus und eine Schale, heut ein Dreimal ein. Die geliebte Müllerin ist mein, ist mein. Die geliebte Müllerin ist mein, ist mein. Mein Frühling, sind das alle deine Blümelein? Sonne, hast du keinen helleren Schein? Ach, so muss ich ganz allein mit dem seligen Worte mein, unverstanden in der weiten Schöpfung sein, unverstanden in der weiten Schöpfung sein. Bächlein, lass dein
That's the original.
Stellt euer
Hey.
Brausen ein, an ihrem unteren Waldvögelein, groß und klein, endet eure Melodein, endet eure Melodein. Durch die Heide, Maus und eine Schale, heut ein Reim allein. Durch die Heide, Maus und eine Schale, heut ein Reim allein. Die geliebte Melodie ist mein, ist mein. Die geliebte Melodie ist mein, ist mein. Mein ist mein.
So again, we can hear what this sounds like, but let's try to connect it to the story a little bit too. He's essentially saying, from all the things that we heard in the previous song, the brook, stop your murmuring, wheels, stop your thundering, all you merry woodland birds, large and small, stop your singing, through the grove, in and out, only one phrase resounds, the beloved miller's daughter is mine, mine! Spring, are these all your flowers? Sun, can't you shine any brighter? Alas, then I must stand all alone, with a blissful word, mine, misunderstood in this vast universe. So what he's essentially saying is, he's saying, stop everything. I've found, maybe my potential wife here. He's saying she is mine. And so I think it makes sense that this song has a little bit of a delusional quality to it. The fact that we hear this key change, again, from D major to B flat major, that signifies that maybe he's getting a little bit off track from his previous goal of getting a job, for example. Or maybe it signifies that he's getting a little bit off track in his thinking. He doesn't know how to think because he's feeling these feelings of love. The music tells us quite a bit if you look for it. Let's continue to the next piece of this song cycle called Withered Flowers. At this point, the miller has passed through various stages of suspicion and anger, and he has nearly resigned himself to his tragic fate. So this is a big change. We're further on in the story. The title alone, Withered Flowers, tells you something. The poem begins in a mournful, self-pitying vein, but the final stanzas introduce a glimmer of hope. The miller imagines a future time when his beloved, passing by his grave, will regret her cruelty. He will be dead, of course, but he will also be vindicated. So remember, he has suspicions that his wife, the miller's daughter, is in love with another, with the hunter. The form of this poem, a series of 8 stanzas, suggests a strophic setting, but Schubert provides something quite different. He sets the first 3 stanzas to a slow, minor mode melody that expresses their tragic sentiment. Then he repeats that melody for the next 3 stanzas. For the final 2 stanzas, however, he shifts to the relative major. That is to say, he moves from E minor to E major. So again, minor tonality going to major tonality. That is sadness moving to happiness or confidence. He also introduces a new melody, all of which is repeated for emphasis. So new ideas, new melody, new key, E major. At the climactic phrase, May has come, the singer soars to the highest notes in his range, and the vocal music concludes on a definitively triumphant note. Once again, however, we would be remiss to ignore the piano accompaniment, which is particularly striking in this example. After 17 songs in which the piano has sparkled and bubbled, now it has suddenly gone dead. We hear only dry, sparse chords for most of the song. This accompaniment reinforces the sorrowful mood of the miller, who has given up hope. The piano comes back to life with the final 2 stanzas and builds in strength as the miller gains confidence. However, the piano also foreshadows the conclusion to this story, which will not be a happy one. Although the singer ends on a triumphant major mode cadence, the closing passage into the piano returns to E minor, so we go back to the minor tonality, as it fades away and moves into the lower ranges of the piano of the instrument. The careful listener knows that the miller's hope is false. Again, short songs. This is Withered Flowers, just about 3.5 minutes here. Sparse piano.
Euch soll man legen mit mir ins Grab. Wie seht ihr alle mich an, so wie, als ob ihr wüsstet, wie mir geschehen. Ihr Blümlein alle, wie welk, wie blass, ihr Blümlein alle, wovon so nass.
Back to here. So repeating the idea of the A section.
Und Lenz wird kommen und Winter wird gehen und Blümlein werden im Grase stehen und Blümlein liegen in meinem Grab. Die Blümlein alle, die sind mir gab. Und wenn sie
Now we're in the major mode.
Hügel vorbei und denkt im Herzen, der meint es treu, dann Blümlein alle, heraus, heraus, der Mai ist kommen, der Winter ist aus. Und wenn sie wandelt am Hügel vorbei und denkt im Herzen, der meint es treu, dann Blümlein alle, heraus, heraus, der Mai ist kommen, der Winter ist aus, dann Blümlein alle, heraus, heraus, der Mai ist kommen, der Winter ist aus.
So again, we end on, after this passage of "and flowers are lying," and when she strolls past my burial place and she thinks to herself, he was true to me. He has this happy feeling knowing that she'll feel bad for what she's done, but at the same time we hear the end, especially with this piano accompaniment moving down to the lowest notes and returning to the minor mode, that his hope is really ill-founded in this particular case. Kind of heartbreaking. The final song in the cycle is entitled The Brook's Lullaby. The narrator is no longer the miller who has drowned himself, but rather the brook, which promises to protect the disappointed lover and see that no more harm comes to him. For this final song, Schubert again provides a strophic setting, full of repeating melodic fragments. This time, however, he is imitating not a folk song, but a lullaby. The melody is gentle and calming. It consists mostly of stepwise motion and is free of dramatic leaps and exciting runs. It almost sounds like a real lullaby, but not quite. Once again, Schubert makes things a bit too complicated by moving from E major to A major for the middle section, and by introducing a flatted pitch near the end that suggests E minor. The result is a particularly passionate lullaby with a hint of sadness. So again, moving to E major to A major, we aren't going to hear it as being happy to sad in this case, but we are at the very end going to hear something that does have this E minor, this minor connotation, minor tonality to it. Again, these are the lyrics here. Rest well, close your eyes, wanderer, you weary one, you are at home. Fidelity is here, you'll lie with me until the sea drains the brook dry. Let's listen to this one. So you hear these little interludes between the vocals, and back to the main idea. Like a strophic song, the same melody with different words this time.
Ein Jagdhorn schallt aus dem grünen Wald, wenn ein Jagdhorn schallt aus dem grünen Wald, will ich sausen und brausen wohl dich her. Blickt nicht herein, blaue Blumen, blickt nicht herein, blaue Blumen. meinem Schläfe die Träume so schwer. Ihr macht meinem Schläfe die Träume so schwer. Hinweg von dem Mühlensteg, hinweg, böses Mägdlein, dass ihn dein Schatten nicht weckt. Wirf mir herein dein Tüchlein fein, wirf mir herein dein Tüchlein fein, dass ich die Augen im Halte bedeckt, dass ich die Augen im Halte bedeckt. Gute Nacht, bis alles wacht. Gute Nacht, bis alles wacht. Schlaf aus deine Freude, schlaf aus dein Leid. Der Vollmond steigt, der Nebel weicht, der Vollmond steigt, der Nebel weicht. Und der Himmel da unten ist er so weit, und der Himmel da oben ist er so weit.
Okay, so it's a very hauntingly beautiful song. I think is meant to be, like it says here, gentle and calming, like a lullaby. But of course, we know that it is also telling a sadder ending to this song cycle. And that does it for Franz Schubert. For now, we are actually going to return to him for a different piece by the same composer later in the chapter. But first, let's shift our attention. So again, we're talking about songs today. We're going to look at one of the most famous song types. It's called a ballad. You can even see here in the 18th century, people were singing ballads in the streets. The term ballad has been around for a long time, but has meant different things in different times and places. The term comes from the French word meaning to dance, for medieval French ballads were in fact dance songs. Today, we think of a ballad as being a slow, romantic song. That meaning of the term, however, dates only from the late 19th century. For most of history, a ballad has been some variety of lengthy song that tells a story. Ballad traditions of this sort are found across Europe and in North Africa, the United States, and Australia. Here, we will examine 3 disparate musical examples that all nonetheless qualify as ballads in this sense. Our first example will be the most traditional insofar as it has been passed down by means of oral tradition for many generations and exists in various versions on either side of the Atlantic. Our second example will be an adaptation of the folk ballad tradition by a 19th century European composer. Third will be a recent ballad composed by an American singer. All three of these ballads tell stories, but each uses music in a different way. We're going to talk about Pretty Polly and this type of song, the British murder ballads. We will begin with a ballad from the tradition of the British Isles. Discussing ballads such as Pretty Polly, however, presents a unique challenge. While each song from Beyoncé's Lemonade or Schubert's The Lovely Maid of the Mill is a specific musical object that can be identified and described, such is not the case with traditional ballads. This is because they belong to an oral tradition, in which songs are passed down from generation to generation by word of mouth without reliance on written sources. Oral tradition often works like an enormous game of telephone. Each time a new person learns the song, they make small changes to the text and/or music. These changes might be intentional or accidental. Some singers consciously decide to improve a melody or alter a few words of text, while others simply forget what they had originally been taught. At first, a song will still be recognizable, but over centuries and great distances, it can acquire a text and melody that bear little relation to the original. In some cases, only a line of poetry or the name of a character betrays the link between two ballads that otherwise seem to have no connection. This is the case with Pretty Polly. We will be examining two versions of the ballad as it was recorded by American folk artists in the 20th century. Even these contemporary versions are significantly different, although a listener can easily recognize that each is a recording of the same song. These variations, however, only scratch the surface. Now, Pretty Polly, we're going to look at its origins. It actually comes from a British ballad, which is even older, called the Gosport Tragedy. So let's read about this. Pretty Polly is a modern descendant of a much older British ballad entitled The Gosport Tragedy. Like many ballads, the Gosport Tragedy narrated real-life happenings, although with a supernatural twist. Names and details included in some versions of the ballad tie it to documented events that took place in 1726. Ballads were often used to commemorate tragedies, celebrate victories, eviscerate politicians, or spread the news of notorious crimes. The Gosport Tragedy falls into the last category, for it tells the story of a ship's carpenter who murdered his pregnant girlfriend before himself perishing at sea. In the final stanzas of early versions, the specter of the betrayed girl appears on board the ship to exact her revenge. As such, the Gosport Tragedy, as well as its New World derivative, Pretty Polly, can be specifically categorized as murder ballad. Just as television viewers today like watching shows about crime, so also regular folks of previous centuries enjoyed hearing about the salacious misdeeds of condemned criminals. As a result, the activities of notorious murderers provided fodder for countless ballads. Most murder ballads specifically tell of young women who lost their lives to deceitful lovers. The purpose of these ballads was not only to thrill and horrify, they also served to instruct and warn. Mothers often sang ballads to their daughters, who received the message that they must withhold sexual favors from suitors until after marriage. The girls in the song, after all, put their own lives at risk when they agreed to leave their homes for a young man who had not made a formal commitment. In this way, ballads provided entertainment while also enforcing social norms. We see here, this is a newspaper clipping of the original Gosport Tragedy, which was printed here. So this is what we call a broadside. A broadside is a single-sided sheet of paper that could contain the text of a ballad. So here we have it. The Gosport tragedy first appeared in print around 1760, but this should not be considered the original or correct version. One of the challenges facing those who wish to study the histories of traditional ballads is that there is never a preserved, authoritative work. While a particular ballad might have begun life as the creation of a specific individual, we almost never know the identity of that person. And, as described above, ballads begin to change immediately upon entering the oral tradition. Most scholars are more interested in examining the many versions of a ballad that proliferate through the repertoire than they are in identifying the most authentic version. The story first told as the Gosport tragedy has appeared under a variety of titles, including The Cruel Ship's Carpenter, Love and Murder, Polly's Love, Molly the Betrayed, and The Fog-Bound Vessel. Some versions have been published in print, while others have been collected by ballad hunters who visit rural areas to record and preserve products of the oral tradition. So again, when we talk about the oral tradition, there's a lot of room for changing the stories, changing the details, but also none of this is written down. The music that we hear, for example, none of it was notated on traditional sheet paper for music. Instead, we have to literally go out and record or transcribe what these melodies or what these songs would sound like. The version known as Pretty Polly emerged in the Appalachian region of the United States. Many immigrants from the British Isles, especially the impoverished Scotch-Irish, who came from a region on the border between England and Scotland, paid for their voyage to the New World by serving as indentured laborers in Pennsylvania. After repaying their debt, they headed into the mountainous regions where land could be obtained for little or no cost. These immigrants had few physical possessions, but they brought in their memories a rich tradition of song. We will examine two versions of Pretty Polly as sung by the traditional Appalachian musicians Dock Boggs and Gene Ritchie. Both grew up in the region and both learned the song as children from older musicians in their families or communities. Although the two versions were recorded in the same year and share many elements in common, they also contain significant differences. These differences reveal the influence of oral culture, the oral culture tradition, and provide insight into the values and practices of folk music culture. And of course, we can see here an 18th century engraving of a ballad singer performing in public. So again, this comes from the folk tradition, not the classical tradition of music. So let's take a look at Dock Boggs, and then we will check out both recordings, one from Dock Boggs and the other one from Gene Ritchie of the same song, Pretty Polly, that we just learned the origins of. Dock Boggs was born in the small town of Northern Virginia, the youngest of 10 children. Boggs grew up in a musical household. His father sang, and several of his older siblings played the banjo. However, none of the children received a formal music education. Instead, they taught each other or sought guidance from other musicians in the community. Boggs began playing on his oldest brother's banjo, and he learned Pretty Polly from his family. He developed a unique playing style based on his observation of African American banjo players at dances, and he sought out the guidance of other black musicians who worked in the area. As a child, however, he never imagined that he might pursue a career in music. This changed in the 1920s, when parallel technological developments, radio and field recording, fed a booming market for rural Southern music. Radio revealed the enormous demand for rural music, especially among those who had moved to northern cities in pursuit of industrial jobs. Many stations began broadcasting regular barn dance programs, which eventually provided work to musicians. At the same time, record companies began sending field representatives into rural Southern communities in pursuit of marketable sounds. Before the 1920s, commercial recordings could only be made in studios, most of which were located in New York City. Beginning in 1923, however, Southern musicians were recorded on site using portable equipment. So again, two things contribute to the success of this kind of folk music in the 1920s. One is radio. The fact that there was a demand to hear music from other areas was also a big part of it too. So we get into that the radio could broadcast music, across larger distances. And we also get into field recording, that all of a sudden you don't have to go to New York City to record yourself singing a song. They could bring portable field recording equipment to the South and record these great musicians who were singing these songs. Boggs had gone to work in the coal mines at the age of 12. Although he continued to play for dances, a source of conflict with his wife, who saw music as a sinful pursuit. During the 1920s, however, he began to see the possibility of a different life. Instead of waiting for a local opportunity, he traveled north to make his first recordings. In 1927, he recorded 8 songs for Brunswick in New York City, and in 1929, he recorded a further 4 songs for Lonesome Ace in Chicago. Just as Boggs glimpsed a professional musical career on the horizon, however, the stock market crash of 1929 inaugurated the Great Depression. Doors closed and he returned to the mines. Although Boggs did not abandon music altogether, hard times led him to pawn his banjo in the late 1930s, and he did not perform at all for the next quarter century. He had left the coal mines in 1954, ending a 44-year career during which he had miraculously escaped serious injury. Boggs settled down to a quiet retirement. In 1963, however, his fortunes shifted yet again. Beginning in the previous decade, an enthusiasm for Appalachian folk music had swept northern college campuses as part of what is known as the Folk Revival. One of the leading figures of the revival, Mike Seeger, had heard and appreciated Boggs' early recordings, and he set out to find him. Within weeks of their first meeting, Seeger had booked appearances for Boggs at all of the major folk festivals and began to record his repertoire of songs. By the time he passed away, Boggs was firmly ensconced as a major figure in American folk music history. Pretty Polly was among the songs that Boggs recorded in 1927, but for the purposes of sound quality, we will examine his 1963 recording for Folkway Records. Even these 2 performances by the same musician are quite different. Boggs does not sing the same set of verses in 1963 that he had sung in his youth, and his timing and inflection have also changed. This is probably not intentional. Folk musicians do not seek to replicate a single ideal performance, and they are prone to forget, discard, alter, and create verses. And of course we can see here a depiction of the banjo, the instrument that Boggs played. It was actually derived from an African instrument that we'll see later in the slides called ngoni, but evolved into this shape in the United States. So we can see it has actually a thin drum head material here at the bottom that helps amplify the sound and gives it its distinctive quality, and also 5 strings, 1, 2, 3, 4 tuning pegs at the top, and 1 other tuning peg right here, so 5 strings in total. Now, we will listen to that version of Pretty Polly from Doc Boggs in a second, but let's first learn about Jean Ritchie so we can compare the 2 artists and their 2 recordings of the same song, even though they're very different. So, although she was a generation younger, Jean Ritchie's childhood was very similar to that of Boggs. She was the youngest of 14 children, born to a farming couple in Perry County, Kentucky. Her family carried on a rich tradition of ballad singing, and 2 of her older sisters were in fact recorded by the most famous Appalachian ballad hunter, Cecil Sharp, in 1917. Ritchie's family believed strongly in education, and she graduated from the University of Kentucky with a degree in social work in 1946. She took a job in her field, but also pursued music seriously, making her first of many recordings in 1952. Ritchie benefited from the folk revival, which provided a large and interested audience for her music. Ritchie was also an accomplished ballad singer, but she is best remembered for her role in popularizing the instrument heard on this recording, the Appalachian dulcimer. The Appalachian dulcimer is a type of fretted zither, examples of which can be found in many traditions around the world. It is descended from a German instrument and was first built by immigrant craftspeople in Pennsylvania. The Appalachian dulcimer became popular in parts of the region because it is easy to build and play. The body is a simple box. Although the melody is only played on the highest string or pair of strings, all of the strings are strummed at the same time. The dulcimer can be used to play simple tunes on its own or to accompany singing, although Ritchie in fact preferred to sing her ballads unaccompanied as she had learned them. And we can see here that this is the Appalachian dulcimer right here, so you can see kind of a unique instrument, and here it is being played by Jean Ritchie on the lap. Ritchie's father played the Appalachian dulcimer, but because he valued the instrument so highly, he forbade his children to touch it. Ritchie, however, could not resist, and she taught herself to play in secret. After she had demonstrated a gift for the instrument, her father conceded to teach her. This story is typical of instrumentalists in the Appalachian folk tradition. Children were almost never encouraged to begin playing an instrument or provided with formal instruction. Instead, those who were interested would figure out how to play independently by listening, watching, and experimenting. The first difference between the Boggs and Ritchie recording is the instrumental accompaniment, the banjo for Boggs and the dulcimer for Ritchie. Both singers, however, provide their own accompaniment, which is typical of ballad performances when they are accompanied at all. Boggs uses the banjo to provide rhythms while at the same time picking out the melody as he sings it. The dulcimer also provides rhythm, but Ritchie does not play the melody while she sings. Instead, she plays various counter melodies on the dulcimer that are distinct from but complement the sung melody. Both performers provide instrumental interludes between some of the verses. The melodies sung by Boggs and Ritchie, however, are not quite the same. Each follows the same general shape, starting low, moving to a higher range, and returning to the low range, and the beginnings are almost identical. There are differences, however, in pitch, rhythm, and general timing. The two singers start at the same tempo, but Boggs gets considerably faster as he goes. We might also compare Boggs and Ritchie as singers. Both sing in a plain, straightforward style, almost as if they are speaking. Neither uses vibrato, that's a wavering of the pitch on the voices that we often hear in all styles of music, but not in folk music sometimes. They also don't seem to put any particular effort into expressing the meaning of the text, or creating an emotional effect. Instead, each simply sings the words, expecting the story to have an impact because of its dramatic contents, not because of the way in which those contents are communicated. All of this is typical of traditional Appalachian ballad singers. So they're not trying to give the song any emotional effect through their voice, other than just singing it straight on and letting the words kind of speak for themselves. It's pretty characteristic of this style. So here we can see the two recordings. I tried to separate them so that you could see them side by side. So at the top here we see Pretty Polly as sung by Dock Boggs. The video that goes along with that is right here. And the other one, Pretty Polly as sung by Jean Ritchie, is right here. Notice too, like they said, that the text is not the same at all. There are some things in common, but they have a lot of things that are very different about them. Let's read that. The most obvious distinction between the recordings, perhaps, lies in the text. Boggs and Ritchie each start the song in quite a different way. Boggs begin with a first-person recollection of courting Pretty Polly. This is reasonable, since he is a male singer, but also strange, since he reverts to the third person in the fourth verse. This is perhaps evidence that he learned several versions of the ballad over the years and combined verses from different sources. The first three verses in Ritchie's version are also in the first person, but this is because she is giving voice to the characters in turn. Her last four verses describe the conclusion of the scene in third person and offer a moralizing final thought. Other singers, such as David Lindley, have been known to change the end of the story allowing Polly to turn the knife on her assailant and walk away alive. So you can change the story kind of as you see fit, as we're seeing in this style. Although the two recordings are obviously of the same song, they have only 4 verses in common, and even those are not identical. Boggs sings 4 verses that Ritchie does not sing, while Ritchie's final 3 verses were not sung by Boggs. This observation only applies to these specific recordings, of course. Both singers performed different sets of verses on different occasions, depending on either the setting or their ability to remember the words. So this is a very beautiful song, actually. I would encourage you to listen to both of these, follow along with the words, and see what key differences do you hear between the two. Okay, now remember I told you that we were going to come back to Franz Schubert, and here we are. So we're going to be taking a look at another song cycle by Franz Schubert that also tells a story. In this type, it is similar to a ballad. This is Franz Schubert's Elf King, and this comes from a poem that was by the poet Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. We see here, this is a depiction of the Elf King story, which we'll get into the details later, but I just love this picture. For our next example, we return to Viennese composer Franz Schubert. We have already examined his approach to musical storytelling using the song cycle as a vehicle. Now we will see how he tells a complex story within a single song. Our example will be perhaps his most famous song, Elf King, which was written in 1815 and in German is Erlkönig. This ballad was inspired by centuries of folk traditions, but also exhibits Schubert's thorough rejection of folk styles. So again, Schubert is an interesting figure. He is inspired by the folk tradition, but he also is creative, and he decides to tell the story in the way that he thinks is going to be best, even if it does break from folk tradition. He is an art composer after all. Seeing as Schubert's career was addressed in the previous section, we will start right with the ballad itself. Before we can discuss the music, however, we must examine the text. And before we can examine the text, we must know something about the famous and influential poet who wrote it, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, who lived from 1749 to 1832. Here's a portrait of Goethe right here. For not being a musician himself, Goethe had an enormous influence on German song composers of the era. To begin with, he wrote hundreds of poetic texts that were intended to be set to music, and indeed, countless composers set his texts thousands of times. However, Goethe also had very strong opinions about how his texts should be set to music. These were informed by his fascination with folk culture, which, following the ideas of Herder, who we heard about earlier, he esteemed highly. So Goethe was almost a follower of the practices of von Herder, who we learned about earlier. The idea of national identity coming from the folk music. Goethe desired that composers setting his texts do their best to imitate folk style, which we have seen well represented in the ballad Pretty Polly. Specifically, he thought that all such songs should be strophic, that they should be simple and accessible, and that the composers should make no effort to interpret the text through music. The purpose of the musical setting, in Goethe's mind, was simply to allow the text to be sung. The listener's focus should be entirely on the words, which the singer would interpret through subtle variations from verse to verse. So essentially, he's advocating for a style similar to what we heard in Dock Boggs and Gene Ritchie's recordings, that we're just singing the straight melody. Everything has a certain folk-like style in its complexity and its simplicity. Goethe studied folk poetry closely and imitated a number of folk forms in his own song texts. One of these was the ballad. Goethe was particularly influenced by the ballads forms of Northern Europe, which had a unique set of characteristics. The stories told in such ballads were preoccupied with supernatural forces and often included dialogue between human and non-human characters. They also ended in disaster. All of this is true of the Gosport tragedy as well, which concludes with a ghost taking her revenge, although the supernatural element was absent in Pretty Polly. They did not really talk about that ghost wife ending in this version of the Gosport tragedy. Let's learn more about von Goeth's poem Elf King. Goethe and other German poets who took their inspiration from European folk traditions often began by translating folk ballads into their own language. Such was the origin of Elf King, which began life as a Danish folk ballad and was first translated by Herder. The German title of the ballad, Erlkönig, in fact represents a mistranslation of the Dutch original Erlkonig, which means king of the alder trees, while the original title, Ellerkong, means king of the elves. So we have some translation errors here. Goeth's version of the ballad tells the same story as the Dutch original, but the specific words are entirely his own. So he's retelling this Danish folk ballad song, but made his own version and adjusted the words. Here's the text to Goeth's poem. This literal translation does not capture the meter or rhyme scheme of the original, but it tells the story as Goethe intended. I'm going to go ahead and read this. So this is from Erlkönig by von Goethe. Who rides so late through night and wind? It is the father with his child. He has the little one well in the arm. He holds him secure. He holds him warm. My son, why hide your face in fear? See you not, father, the elf king? The elf king with crown and flowing cloak? My son, it is a wisp of fog. So they're already riding through the night on a horse. We can't quite tell that, but we will find that out later. And the son is saying, don't you see that elf king, that evil figure? Let's continue here. So we are switching back between the father and the son as kind of the storytellers right now. Now here, we see a sudden change. We're going to jump to the perspective of the elf king himself. He says, you sweet child, come along with me. Such wonderful games I'll play with you. Many lovely flowers are at the shore. My mother has many golden garments. Then the son comes back in. My father, and do you not hear what the elf king quietly promises to me? Be calm, stay calm, my child. The wind is rustling the dry leaves. Now back to the elf king here. Won't you come along with me, fine boy? My daughters shall attend to you so nicely. My daughters do their nightly dance, and they will rock you and dance you and sing you to sleep. Back to the son. My father, do you not see there? Elf King's daughters in that dark place? My son, I see it definitely. It is the willow trees looking so gray. Then back to the Elf King. I love you, I'm charmed by your beautiful shape, and if you are not willing, then I will use force. Back to the son. My father, now he has taken hold of me. Elf King has hurt me. The father shudders. He rides swiftly. He holds in arm the groaning child. He reaches the farmhouse with effort and urgency. In his arms, the child was dead. So we can see this is very much like a fairy tale in this story here. So the musical setting, like we learned already, von Goethe had his poems set to music by many different composers. So we're going to take a look at a first example to show kind of a plain and a version that would have followed Goethe's rules or his preferences for how his words would be set to music. Let's read about this. In writing his version of the ballad, Goethe used simple language that reflected the speech of ordinary Germans. The structure of his poem, however, is fairly sophisticated. The first and last stanzas are spoken in the voice of an unidentified narrator. The first sets the scene, while the last delivers the tragic conclusion. The internal stanzas consist entirely of speech from the three characters, father, son, and elf king. The father and son converse in stanzas 2, 4, and 6. the son expressing his fear and the father offering assurances that there is no real danger. The Elf King seeks to tempt the child away in stanzas 3 and 5. In stanza 7, the Elf King changes strategies and takes the child by force, provoking a frenzied response. The poem can be read literally or as a metaphor for childhood illness and disease and death. Goethe first created his ballad for use in a play entitled The Fisherwoman. In the first scene of the play, the title character is seen washing dishes and singing a simple folk song, Elf King, as befits her lowly social status. So the first setting was in a play, actually. The music for the play was composed by the actress herself, Corona Schroeder. In setting the poem, Schroeder adhered closely to Goethe's preferences. She created a strophic setting in which every verse of the ballad is sung to the same melody. That melody, in turn, is charming in its simplicity. Schroeder makes no effort to capture the drama or terror of the text in her music. In short, it is easy to hear her version as being a real folk song. So again, this is the video performance by Corona Schroeder. It really does follow Goethe's ideas that his music should be set to very simple music with very simple presentation of the text through that music. Let's go ahead and listen to just a little bit of Corona Schroeder's version.
Mein Sohn, was birgst du so bang dein Gesicht? Siehst, Vater, du den König nicht, den König mit Kron und Schweif. Mein Sohn, es ist ein Nebelstreif.
So that's just one stanza of this song. I'm not going to play the whole thing because actually all 5 settings, all 5 verses are the exact same. It follows the same melody, even though it does tell the further part of the story. The setting, the music itself, is exactly the same. Now ask yourself, when you listen to that music, does it sound like it's telling kind of a scary story? Does it sound like the sound of a child being afraid of this evil elf king? Not quite. Again, the music is simple, it's meant to just portray the words, but it does not quite mirror the feelings that we might envision. So, we're going to look at how Schubert takes on the Elf King, which I think is a more interesting version. By the time Franz Schubert took on Goethe's ballad, the text was well known and had been set to music by many composers. Schubert was unknown at the time, but his innovative and compelling version of Elf King would attract a great deal of attention and establish him as an important composer of songs. Schubert completely ignored Goethe's instructions. Instead of taking a folk-like approach, he went to great lengths to capture the characters and events depicted in the text. His setting begins with a turbulent piano introduction, in which we hear both the pounding hooves and raging storm. At the end of the song, we hear in the piano the gradual slowing of the horse as it comes to a clattering stop in front of the farmhouse. All of these are examples of text painting, a technique by which composers translate dramatic elements into sound. Text painting, of course, went against the folk tradition, as did using the piano to set a mood. So again, he's not following Goethe's instructions. He's using his own creativity to tell the story and really bring it to life. In addition, Schubert's piano part is much too difficult to be genuine folk music. Only a highly accomplished piano player could ever hope to execute it well. And here we see, this is a painting of a scene from the same story, Der Erlenking, In this case, this is by Moritz von Schwind. It's the same story that we see the writer, the father with the child, and the elf king right here with his daughters that we read about through the lyrics. Let's continue with Schubert's take on this story. Schubert's disobedience does not stop there. His setting of the ballad is not strophic, but through composed. We've learned both those words already in this chapter. With each passage of music carefully designed to express the associated text. Schubert creates a sort of miniature one-man opera with his setting. Although Elf King is performed by a solo singer, that singer assumes all four characters, the narrator, the father, the son, and the Elf King, and portrays each in their respective dramatic roles. This is done using a variety of means. To begin with, the voice of each character is heard in a unique range, again, a pitch range. The narrator sings in a neutral middle range, while the father sings in the low range with a deep, booming voice. The son sings in a high, childlike range, while the Elf King sings quietly in an even higher range. So he is kind of a ghostly figure. He's singing in this high range. Schubert also uses other techniques to distinguish his characters and bring the scene to life. While the father and son repeat the same melodies and rhythms, the Elf King constantly introduces new musical material as he tries various approaches to tempting the child away. So again, the father and son sing the same melodies throughout the piece, but the Elf King's melodies change as he's trying to lure this child to take him away with him. The Elf King is also the only character who sings in the major mode, a musical embodiment of his charming speech. He does not shift to the minor mode until his final threatening words, "Then I will use force." So remember, he's trying to tempt, he's not trying to steal him at first, he's trying to seduce him into coming with him. So he uses the major mode. The greatest musical disruption takes place with the final line of the text. In order to maximize the impact of the story's tragic conclusion, Schubert silences the piano and has the singer deliver the news out of time and without accompaniment. Following the final two words, "was dead," the piano executes an abrupt cadence and the song is over. So again, always remember that silence is a very powerful part of music. So when we hear no piano for the first time in the whole song, and we only hear these words, "was dead," the sad news of the child passing, it is really a shock. And then we finally hear the piano to kind of close things out with this abrupt cadence, or cadence just means ending. Now, there are two videos here. I would suggest to watch both of them because it's such an exciting piece. This first one has our standard listening notes. We see all 8 stanzas of the text and what's happening along with it. This also shows a live performance that also has the English translation of the text as well. So let's go ahead and check out this version of Der Erlkönig, the Elf King, as set by Franz Schubert, which has more interesting and dramatic accompaniment, musical imagery, tone painting, and shifting character from the singer. Again, sound of hooves and thunder from the piano. Not folk music, this is difficult piano. Here's the Elf King.
Komm, geh mit mir, der schöne Schnee spielt mit dir.
Then we hear the major mode.
Blumen sind da ins Land, meine Mutter hat mein Frühling gewandt. Mein Vater, und hörst du nicht, was Erdenkönig mir leise verspricht? Sei ruhig, bleib ruhig, mein Kind, in Höhen gelandet, freut dir viel. Willst heilige Knabe, du mit mir gehen, meine Tochter soll dich warten schön, meine Töchter führen den nächtlichen Wein und fliegen und tanzen und singen dich ein, sie fliegen und tanzen und singen dich ein. Mein Vater, und siehst du nicht dort, Erkennttöchter ist ein Ort. Mein Sohn, ich seh es genau, es scheinen die alten Weiden so nah. Ich liebe dich, mich reizt eine schöne Gestalt, und bist du nicht so willig, so brauch ich den Welt. Mein Vater, jetzt fasst mich an. König hat mir mein Leid getan. Geleitet geschwind, hält ihn an, das ächzende Kind. Reicht ihn hoch mit mir und Mut. In seinen Armen das Kind war tot.
Oh, I love that piece. It's such a good way of showing characterization, of course, too. Especially that one singer has to shift their role as these various characters within the story, but also just how the music really reflects what's going on. It's much more vivid than we saw in the previous example. The same poetry, the same story, but with a different composer really brings it to life in a different way. Now, if you enjoyed that and you wanted to get more into the story, this is the same piece, same version, probably a different singer, but this is nice because it actually has some very well done animation too that helps tell the story. So I would, again, pause this video and check out this example here of Erlkönig with the animation. Now we're going to continue on to our last example of a ballad. And this time it's going to be Bobbie Gentry's Ode to Billie Joe. We can see here Bobbie Gentry, who became a very successful singer in the 1980s, although she never surpassed this hit, Ode to Billie Joe. Now, by rejecting the norms of folk songs and making an effort to develop a nuanced musical characteristics, Schubert created a compelling ballad that has remained a popular favorite in intervening centuries. That is not to say, however, that his approach to setting ballad text is in any way superior to that of the folk tradition, nor that it was destined to replace the folk-inspired approach. Many later song composers use simple strophic settings to amplify the emotional power of ballad texts and communicate effectively with listeners. So again, even though I was just saying how vivid and exciting the Erlkönig version is by, in the previous example, by Schubert, it's not to say that the folk tradition is not any less powerful or valid, of course. Now, although there are many excellent examples of 20th century ballads composed in a folk style, we will examine only one, Bobbie Gentry's 1967 hit, Ode to Billie Joe. Gentry was born in rural Mississippi and many of her songs describe the difficulties of life in the impoverished regions of the South. She taught herself to play a variety of instruments as a child and wrote her first songs at the age of 7. Although she later performed at nightclubs, her ambition was to become a songwriter, not a singer. When she first recorded "Ode to Billie Joe" as a demo for Capitol Records, she only sang the song herself to avoid the cost of hiring a performer. So she didn't think that she'd become a successful singer, she thought she'd be a songwriter. The producers at Capitol Records commissioned arranger Jimmy Haskell to add strings to Gentry's recording, for which she had to accompany herself on acoustic guitar. Haskell wrote parts for 4 violins and 2 cellos, which were then recorded and dubbed onto the existing demo. Dubbing is just adding adding extra musical parts to a pre-recorded take. In this case, it was adding the strings, the violin, and the cello to Gentry's version with just the voice and the guitar. Gentry's song also needed to be shortened in length, for the original recording was 8 minutes long, containing 11 verses of Billie Joe's story. The final product, at 4 minutes and 15 seconds, was still long for a pop single, but the song struck a popular nerve. It spent 4 weeks at the top of the charts and finished the year in 3rd place. The song's power lies in its storytelling. The first 4 verses describe a farming family coming together over the dinner table. In between passing the dishes, they comment on the news that a local boy, Billie Joe McAllister, had jumped to his death from the Tallahatchie Bridge earlier in the day. Over the course of various dispassionate reminiscences, we learn that the song's female narrator was friends with Billie Joe, and in the 4th verse, we are presented with the information that she was seen with Billie Joe just the day before, throwing something off of the same bridge from which he was soon to jump. The final verse takes us 1 year into the future, at which point the narrator's brother has moved away and her father has died. She reports that she spends most of her time dropping flowers off of the bridge. So again, we see this is Capitol Records where Bobby Gentry would have recorded Billie Joe, The ballad's narrative is bleak throughout, and its portrayal of the character's stagnation and hopelessness is compelling. The song's greatest power, however, has always lain in its mystery. What did the narrator in Billie Joe throw off of the bridge? Despite being asked throughout her career, Gentry always refused to say. She also never explained why Billie Joe committed suicide. Indeed, she has claimed not to know herself. While the listener is allowed to glimpse the daily life of the song's characters, we are not offered any insight into their thoughts or motivations. Like Pretty Polly, Ode to Billie Joe uses a simple, repetitive melody as a vehicle for a long, complex, and ultimately tragic story. In fact, the melodies are strikingly similar. Each begins with an ascending melodic gesture, and each repeats its opening melodic phrase at a higher pitch level before returning to the original, lower range. Gentry's model is just a bit more complex, insofar as it moves to the high range twice and ends with a unique melodic phrase. In both cases, however, the melody serves the same purpose. On the practical side, it provides a vehicle with which the singer can tell the story. On the affective side, it sets an appropriate mood that adds to the story's impact. While the minor mode of Pretty Polly is generally appropriate to a tragic narrative, Gentry takes a different approach. Although her melody contains blues-inspired inflections, in this case the 3rd scale degree is sometimes lowered, and the 7th scale degree is always lowered. It is accompanied by major mode harmonies that, in combination with a lively tempo, produces a sound world that is not necessarily depressing. At the same time, however, the cheerfulness of the tune throws the darkness of the lyrics into sharp relief. According to Gentry, Ode to Billy Joe was a study in unconscious cruelty that explored the inability of the characters to communicate and empathize with one another. Each is isolated by their own grief. The inexpressive music, therefore, seems to emphasize the repressed emotions hidden by the narrator and her mother. The various sounds of Ode to Billy Joe also give depth to the story and contribute to the song's impact on the listener. We might start with Gentry's voice, which is natural and unaffected. A touch of roughness adds an expressive character to her singing, while also helping the listener identify her as a regular person. The fact that she is not overly trained as a performer makes her story and emotion seem more authentic. Her guitar accompaniment is sparse and rhythmic, propelling the music along with a minimum of effort. The strings were added to make the album commercially viable, but they also have a dramatic effect. We're talking about the violins and cellos. The sliding harmonies emphasize the laziness of the scene, while the final spiraling descent illustrates the flowers falling from the bridge into the muddy water below. Now, I would encourage you, pause this video, watch this one instead, Ode to Billy Joe by Bobbie Gentry. This is a really, really excellent song. And try to reflect on what they're saying here. How does the music contribute to these very subtle aspects of the story? Even though this is very plainly sung, the decisions that she made in composing the songs, the lyrics themselves, this darkness of the lyrics, despite some of the cheerful sounding music, really is, again, a dichotomy. So take a listen to this. It's a really, really great piece of music. Now, in Chapter 4, we explore the origins of European opera and the influence of ancient Greek music on the genre. One of the aspects of ancient Greek music that directly inspired the creation of opera was the notion that ancient Greek poetry and drama were sung in their entirety, not spoken, like what is witnessed when attending a Shakespearean play. So again, not like that, it is sung, not spoken, these poems. Although the lack of surviving musical notation from the period leaves us with little evidence as to how ancient Greek drama actually sounded, the few surviving musical fragments in our theoretical knowledge of both music and poetic recitation in ancient Greece provide us with a good idea as to how Greek poetry and drama might have been sung. Greek drama grew out of a tradition of community gathering and singing, particularly during festivals and sacrifices in praise of such gods as Dionysus or Apollo. To accompany these celebrations, there would be songs of praise, setting dramatic poetry pertaining to the celebrated figures or other mythical beings. Although the tradition began with the community singing these songs in a chorus setting, eventually solo singers would emerge from the chorus to act out the part of the god or hero. While the chorus acted as a narrator or took part in sung dialogue with the soloist, thus the beginning of Greek theater emerged, and the solo actor and chorus dynamic became a staple in the Greek theater tradition. So we saw this with Orpheus last week, that we have the one main character, Orpheus, and maybe some other main characters that he runs into, but we also see the Greek chorus, the rest of the singers who are really just narrating or commenting on what is happening in the scenes. This all emerges from the Greek drama tradition of group singing moving into these solo roles. Many Greek dramas have been preserved through their texts, and many have become well-known classics in today's world. However, through further study of some of the fragments of poetry from ancient Greece, it is now believed that the poetry in dramas were meant to be performed in musical settings. In later Greek dramas, melodic notation has preserved the ancient sung melodies, and there has yet to be found any surviving form of rhythmic notation from this time. It is understood, however, that the rhythm of the sung words was based off of the prosody, or the meter of the poetry. Poetic meter, similar to musical meter, structures the rhythm of spoken, or in this case sung, prose. So again, poetic meter is the organization of the actual lines. How is it rhythmically delivered? When we get into this with music, we call it prosody. A common example of a poetic meter used in Greek drama is dactylic hexameter. In this type of meter, a poetic phrase is divided into 6 feet, similar to the idea of a measure in musical notation. Each foot is divided by what is called a dactyl, a long syllable followed by 2 short syllables. In this type of meter, a dactyl can also be substituted by a spondee or 2 long syllables. When recited, the spoken or sung phrase would follow this pattern of long and short syllables, producing a steady rhythm. So we see here long, short, short, long, short, short, long, etc. So again, this is how they would group the words, and it produces this rhythm that could therefore be easily set to music. One famous example of a Greek epic in dactylic hexameter is Homer's Iliad. The Iliad was written to be accompanied by a 4-stringed lyre, which is a type of primitive harp, and although there are no surviving fragments of actual melodic notation attached to the poetry, it is believed that this epic was meant to be sung in its entirety. A sung melody could be based off of an improvisation based on the inflection of the text. For instance, if the approximate pitch goes up at the end of the word in natural speech, it likewise ascends to a higher note when sung. So again, they're mimicking natural speech. The melodies of poetic recitations were probably folk-like in nature, that is to say, simple and repetitive. The tempo is set by the content of the text. In scenes of heightened tension, the music may be fast, while the music used in describing a more solemn scene may be slow. And here we see a scene from the Iliad. The kithara is an ancient Greek instrument similar to a harp or lyre that was often used to accompany recited poems. Similar instruments can be found across the ancient world, including ancient Egypt. As seen in this video, notice how the instrument can be strummed like a guitar, plucked like a harp, or a combination of these techniques all at once. The construction of the instrument also means that you have to dampen the strings you do not want to sound when playing a chord more than one note at a time. So again, if you want to hear the sound of ancient Greece a little bit, this is a great video that shows the playing of the kithara, which is not that different from the lyre. It's just a little bit bigger of an instrument shape. Although most of the musical elements of Homer's dramas are uncertain and therefore must be left to the performer's interpretation, which is based on the nature of the text, there are several surviving fragments of poetry and drama written in stone or on papyrus that are accompanied by written musical notation. The ancient Greeks had a system of musical notation in which a pitch would be associated with a particular symbol, usually a symbol from the Greek alphabet. This pitch symbol would be written above the syllable of the sung word. One of the few surviving fragments of music written on papyrus comes from Euripides' Orestes. The play tells the story of Orestes, the son of Clytemnestra and Agamemnon, who kills his mother to seek revenge for his father's death. The fragment is of a song sung by the chorus in unison. They sing of Orestes being chased by his mother's furies, or spirits of revenge. So again, this is music written down here that would have come from ancient Greece. So let's talk about the Orestes chorus by Euripides. Unlike the simple repetitive melody that Homer's words would have been most likely performed to, the melody of the Orestes chorus, believed to be composed by Euripides himself, is through composed. The melody also differs from the Homeric poetry in that it doesn't follow the natural inflection of the spoken Greek text, though there are instances in which important words are sounded at a higher pitch for emphasis. The rhythm follows the Dokmaic poetic meter, a meter typically used to convey agitation, anxiety, or distress. This sense of distress can certainly be heard in our example. There, we will also see the choir accompanied by an aulos, a double pipe instrument. This instrument was often used to accompany choruses in dramatic productions. As is evident through this performance, with musical translation and a bit of reconstruction, this ancient music is now able to be performed with near perfect historical accuracy. The revival of the music alongside the poetry sheds a new light on the emotional impact of this drama on ancient audiences and allows modern audiences a glimpse of this once forgotten art that inspired future forms of sung drama. So again, you can check out this video. Very interesting to think that we have music that comes from one of the leading Greek playwrights, and we call him a tragedian, somebody who writes Greek tragedies. This is also a video that I pulled. It's a really amazing and compelling performance of the Delphic Paean by Athenaeus. This is performed by a vocalist and an aulos player. And you can see even in as early as 480 BCE depicts a woman playing the same instrument that we see here, the aulos. She's actually playing two auloses. Again, check out this video. It's really amazing. This is quite an exceptional recording. And we're going to come to our last example here. This comes from West Africa, more specifically the Mandinka Empire, the Malian Empire. Is called the Sunjata story. Perhaps the richest extant tradition of epic recitation is to be found among the Mandinka people of West Africa, and their most valued epic is certainly the story of Sunjata, the founder of the ancient Mali Empire. A complete recitation of the Sunjata story can take between 6 and 8 hours. This telling of the story is therefore a remarkable feat in and of itself. All the more so because its words are maintained entirely in the memories of the storytellers. So nothing is written down, they memorize the whole thing. The epic is the property of the Jali caste, members of which are responsible for passing it from generation to generation. Founded in 1240, the Mali Empire occupied all or part of half a dozen modern West African countries. It flourished until 1645, when conflict over accession to the throne resulted in the collapse of the empire. Although the Mali Empire was large and powerful, its history has largely been told from outside perspectives. This is because its inhabitants did not cultivate written language, instead maintaining knowledge by means of oral transmission, a process that carries into the present day. The Mandinka, who currently number about 32 million, are the descendants of the Mali Empire, and they continue to celebrate their common heritage through story and song. So again, this ties again to the oral tradition, this oral transmission, that these songs, these stories are not written down, but passed along from person to person, from generation to generation. And in this case, if this story is about the founding of the empire, this must be from maybe even 1240. Before we can examine Mandican storytelling practices, we need to know something about the people who tell those stories. Traditionally, Mandican society was organized according to a caste system, meaning that social roles were determined by birth and were strictly defined. Members of the Jali caste were musicians and storytellers, and their role was to serve the aristocratic caste. You might be familiar with the French term griot, which is more widely used in the West, but members of the community generally prefer the term Jali. Although the caste system is officially defunct today, it still exerts an influence on modern society, and Jali continue to pass their knowledge and skills down through family lines. So this shows here the territory that was ruled by the Mali Empire between 1240 and 1645. This is a huge region of West Africa. The Jali caste was not high-ranking, but its members were considered to have special powers and to occupy a unique place in the community. They were considered ritually impure and were prohibited from wearing the clothes of the aristocracy or sitting in their beds. They were considered ritually impure and were prohibited from wearing the clothes of the aristocracy or sitting on their beds. When they died, they were buried separately from other members of the community. Jolly also could not hold political office. At the same time, Jolly served as advisors to aristocrats and could therefore be very powerful. If a Jolly was captured in battle, they could not be killed or enslaved, but were expected to serve their captor as they had served their previous master. So they occupy this very interesting place in the social structure. The responsibilities of the Jolly were many. They were musicians, and as such, they provided ceremonial music for naming ceremonies, marriages, and agricultural celebrations. They also entertained at dances and wrestling matches and sang the praises of the aristocrats they served. However, the primary role of the Jolly was to maintain and transmit the knowledge and traditions of the community, including histories, genealogies, proverbs, and laws. If the Jolly did not fulfill their function, therefore, society itself would disintegrate. Apart from these weighty tasks, the Jolly also served as moralists, counselors, spokesmen, public announcers, mediators, messengers, buffoons, porters, tax collectors, and hairdressers. So you can see they played a huge role in society, and they really are concerned most about keeping the civilization and the structures of the civilization, the history of the civilizations going, so that people know who they are and their history. Now, the Jolly enjoyed dominion over specific musical instruments. These included the Ngoni, a small lute made from wood and covered with goat skin. This actually leads to the banjo later on, we'll see in a later chapter. The balafone, which is a xylophone in which wood keys are strung over gourd resonators, and the kora. We'll see a picture of all three of these. This is the kora right here. We'll talk about it now. The last of these is certainly the most remarkable, the kora, and has retained the deepest connection with the Jolly tradition. The kora is a type of harp lute, the strings of which are suspended above a large resonator made out of a calabash gourd covered with cowskin. So we can see here, this is the gourd, like almost like a big pumpkin. It's not a pumpkin, but a big calabash gourd with an animal skin stretched across the top. And we can see these are the strings that are attached to this large pole here. The strings are plucked with the thumb and index finger of each hand. All three of these instruments are used to play complex melodic patterns constructed out of complementary interlocking parts. Parts that, at least on the balafone and kora, are each played with one of the two hands. Traditionally, these instruments were only played by men. Boys would begin to learn from their fathers or uncles, and the Jolly's musical education would culminate in the building of his own instrument. A Jolly also needed to master the tuning systems, which are different for each instrument and quite like anything found in Europe. A result of this is that West African music can sound out of tune, although in fact each pitch is carefully positioned. Female Jolly were musicians too, but they were only trained to sing and play a percussion instrument called the neo. Today, of course, many women excel as performers on all of these instruments. So, like I was saying, we see here the two other instruments that they mentioned, the Ngoni, which kind of looks like a lute or guitar. This later evolves into the banjo in the United States by African Americans. And down here is the balafone, which is a xylophone type instrument. Again, we see these calabash gourds that are suspended underneath the bars of this instrument, and they act as resonators. They make the sound of these wooden bars sound more full and a little bit louder as well. I've actually been able to play these types of instruments before, and there are actually little spider webs that grow inside of these gourds that give it a slight buzzy sound that is actually considered desirable. So it's a very interesting part of the sound of that instrument. The Sunjata story is well known, for it has been frequently published in both novel and verse form over the past century, and it is often included in world literature courses. It constitutes a mythologized retelling of how the historical figure Sunjata unified the Mali Empire and became its first ruler. According to the epic, Sunjata, whose glorious conquest had been foretold by a soothsayer, was the son of the Mandinkan king's second wife. As a child, however, Sunjata could not walk, and when the king died, it was his half-brother who ascended to the throne. Sunjata and his mother were exiled and found a new home in the Mima kingdom, where Sunjata grew strong and gained such widespread support that he was designated heir to the throne. When the Mandinka kingdom was attacked by a malicious power, Sunjata came to the rescue while his half-brother fled in fear. Sunjata's coalition of small kingdoms defeated the aggressor and resulted in the founding of the Mali Empire. There are not many recordings of the Sunjata story in existence, for it's carefully guarded. The epic is often related as part of religious ceremonies, and is believed to bring blessings to all who hear it. Listeners, however, are prohibited from recording these performances. The recordings that are available have been made at formal concerts or recording sessions, and therefore lack many of the elements that would characterize a more authentic performance. These recordings tend to be brief, both because they often omit episodes from the story and because they lack the participatory embellishments that bring the story to life when it is shared in a communal context. So what they're saying here is that because this is performed on a stage and not in the social setting that this would normally be performed in, there is less participation from the listeners and the person who's reciting the story. It isn't that different from what we learned about the Greek storytelling practices. Listeners, for example, might join together in singing hymns at appropriate points, or Jolly might shout out praise songs dedicated to historical figures as they enter the narrative. Participants will also interrupt the story to donate money in return for blessings. In considering our recordings, therefore, we must be aware that they offer only a glimpse of Sunjata epic recitation as a living practice. Remember that this is between 6 and 8 hours long too, but we're also just not getting the full experience of this. Apart from being brief, they are in no way definitive. There are variations in the words that are used to tell the story, and even in the events that are related. Sometimes, for example, Sunjata and his mother are exiled from the Mali kingdom, while other times they choose to leave for their own safety. So these are small differences. The epic is also not always sung to the same melody, nor is the accompaniment stable. The underlying instrumental music might be supplied by kora, balafon, nyoni, or even guitar. The pattern played by these instruments, known as the kumbengo, can vary in large and small ways. So again, this is just the accompaniment pattern that follows the singer is the kumbengo, played by one of these instruments. We will begin with a recording made of a 1987 performance in which Jali Jalimadi Sissoko recites the epic while Sidiki Diabati accompanies him on the kora. Like all performances, this begins with an instrumental improvisation. At first there is no pulse, but gradually the player settles into the kumbengo. In this case, we hear the most typical kumbengo for a Sunjata epic recitation, that associated with the Sunjata praise song. So this is just one of the accompaniment patterns. The praise song is entirely separate from the epic, but it might be sung during a ritual performance of the epic, and the two are closely connected. The singer enters at the top of his range and then descends down the scale outlined in the accompaniment. This is the typical melodic shape for epic recitation, and it is influenced by the Mandinka language, which is a tonal language. This means that the inflection of vowel sounds change the meaning of a word. Because most Mandinka words inflect in a downward direction, setting the words to music naturally produces a descending melody. The vocal ability of a singer is judged in terms of power and confidence. However, The most important quality for a singer to possess is truthfulness. A good singer, therefore, is one whose words are true, regardless of the sound of their voice. The truthfulness of Jomemadi Sissoko's words is confirmed by Siddiqui Diabate, who fulfills the role of witness by chanting Namu, or indeed. So he's part of the agreeing with what the storyteller is saying at the end of every sentence. If the Jolly makes a mistake in telling the story, which frequently occurs, the witness must correct it. So there is kind of a fail-safe or a checks and balances system here, because remember, this is the story of the history of the people. So they're going to want to make sure that it is told right every time that it is told. Let's compare these two versions, but let's talk about the music. The groove is an important characteristic of this performance, as is the rhythmic interaction between the singer and the kora player. However, these elements are not simple to perceive or explain. While the repetitiveness of the accompaniment makes it obvious that there is a regular pulse, that pulse is constantly shifting. So this is some unique things about this Mendinkan rhythm and music, and the perception of pulse is that it can shift in a way that is not as common in the music that we've been talking about previously. They suggest, try tapping your foot along to the music, and you will soon find that you have lost the beat. This is the result of a concept of rhythm that is based on patterns, not European-style meter. So remember we talked about duple meter, triple meter, quadruple meter. This is not really conceived of in the same way. It's more about patterns and variations, constantly shifting of these patterns. West African musicians, for example, do not count beats in the same way European musicians do, and they do not recognize a downbeat, which is the first and strongest pulse in a metrical grouping, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. They don't quite recognize that strong beat 1 pulse. Instead, they transform rhythmic patterns in the way that a kaleidoscope transforms images. This concept of constant transformation is central to the practice of West African instrumentalists. In this recording, the kora player never repeats the kumbengo pattern unchanged for long. Instead, he makes constant alterations to the rhythmic and pitch content, adding syncopations and ornaments of unending variety. He also interjects virtuosic flourishes in between the phrases of the story. Periodically, the singer pauses to allow for an extended kora solo. While the basic musical contents of the kumbengo are quite simple, therefore, the work of the kora player is a complex and sophisticated one. So this is our first example at the top here of the Sunjata story by the performers that we just described. It features the kora and the lead storyteller reciting this part of the epic. And this is a shorter example that shows the Sunjata praise song, which is related to the epic, but not quite the same thing. We will briefly examine a second performance of episodes from the Sunjata story for the sake of comparison. This rendition, recorded in 2014, is accompanied by the balafon. Although the balafon, which is a percussion instrument, is quite different from the kora in terms of construction, playing technique, and sound, it executes exactly the same function. Again, the performance opens with an extended solo by the balafon player this time, who is Fode Lasana Diabete, who eventually settles into a kumbengo that is very similar to that played on the kora. Again, the balafon player constantly alters his accompaniment, adding rhythm and melodic variations. And again, he occasionally takes the opportunity to improvise extended instrumental solos in between sections of the recited text. The work of the singer, Hawakase Madi Diabete, can also be compared to the previous recording. Most of her phrases begin high in her range and descend down the scale. She regularly enters during different parts of the kumbengo and does not align her phrases with the accompaniment. And her vocal production is powerful and commanding. She periodically plays a simple percussion instrument known as a shekere, which consists of a gourd with a beaded cover, so it's a type of a shaker. Although this rendition is excellent, its context, amplified on a stage before a silent audience, is far removed from that which in the Sunjata story has thrived for 800 years. Jolly storytelling is meant to be highly participatory, and this epic only lives when it is endorsed and enriched by the community. So again, it's that relation between the audience and the performers. This is almost, there are no boundaries here. It's about getting everyone involved in the telling of this story in some way. Again, I hope that you pause and check out these two videos that are excerpts of the Sunjata story and from a different take with some different instruments and other variety too. And our last slide here, just one more video to check out. This time it features, again, the kora, a little bit more close and personal so you can see how the instrument works. You can also see just from the thumbnail, this is an electric kora, so it has the ability to be plugged in through an amplifier, just like an electric guitar would. And he's also going to talk about an instrument called the djembe, which is a West African drum that can be found across many different cultures in West Africa. And here's our last quote. In Mande society, the Jali was an historian, advisor, arbitrator, praise singer who offered patronage, and a storyteller. They essentially served as history books, preserving ancient stories and traditions through song. Their tradition was passed down through generations. The name Jali means blood in Manika language. They were believed to have deep connections to spiritual, social, or political powers. Speech was believed to have power in its capacity to recreate history and relationships. So I hope that you check out this video here again of the Jali, this great TED Talk, and that's it for this week. So if you have any questions, with your homework assignment, please reach out to me and enjoy doing that work, taking some good notes to remember all of this important information presented in this chapter about song. Have a great week, and I'll see you next time.